What's happening, Packers Nation? Welcome into the Pack-A-Day podcast here on YouTube. It is Saturday. We're in the midst of March Madness, and the Packers still have not signed anyone, at least up until this point. I don't think that's super surprising that they haven't been super aggressive up until this point with external free agents, but I guess if I was a betting person, I probably would have bet that they would have done something external by this point, but they have not. And again, I think this is the time to kind of go bargain shopping if you're Brian Gutekunst and try to see if you can fill out some of those roster spots with some potential, whether it's veterans or younger guys that you think can come in and compete, whether it be on special teams as a core member of the roster. Just providing depth, whatever it may be. This next couple weeks, and how he fills out this roster prior to the draft is really going to be of extra importance as Green Bay tries to make a serious run at a Super Bowl this upcoming season. So I know it's been a little bit frustrating this week, not seeing any specific movement other than players who have been on the team already, which is still relevant, of course. You get back Aaron Jones, you make the move to keep Preston Smith. Those are all important additions to your team this season. But again, I think a lot of people were hoping that there would have been maybe an external move to maybe shore up the secondary defensive line, maybe some depth along the offensive line. There's definitely a section of the fan base that's still hoping for a top tier wide receiver. But either way, I think something still will get done eventually. I'm thinking definitely more mid-tier free agent than top tier free agent. At this point, let's be real. A lot of the top tier free agents are gone at this point, but we'll definitely see, and it's definitely going to make for a couple interesting weeks as we go along. And again, maybe as you're listening to this, maybe they've already signed a free agent. We shall see. But a couple topics that I want to get into today. Let's start off with Aaron Rodgers and his roster bonus. For those who weren't aware, his roster bonus was due on Friday, which means that if they wanted to restructure it, change it to signing bonus, and clear some space, that they would have had to have done it prior to Friday. There was nothing on the transaction wire and no announcement that indicated that. Now, it's possible that they did it and it just didn't get, on the transaction wire for the day. It's possible that Rodgers and the Packers negotiated a deadline further down the road so that they didn't have to make that decision on an arbitrary day in March. It doesn't affect Rodgers. In fact, he'd probably prefer that decision gets pushed back if they want to be able to sign more free agents. So that's within the realm of possibility as well. It's possibility maybe they worked out something bigger. And again, it just hasn't been announced or verified by the league yet. We, at least as of the recording of this episode, we just simply don't know. That being said, if they did in fact pass the deadline and Green Bay just paid the roster bonus at this point, it's not super telling in the fact that I never thought that they were going to take all of his roster bonus and, regular season money or base salary, I guess I should say, and take all of it and turn it into signing bonus and spread it out. Like, that would have been a massively aggressive move. And quite frankly, I don't think that would have been the best thing to do anyway, even if they're trying to go quote unquote all in. I just don't think that's the best idea at this point. I always thought they would do something, but they still have plenty of base salary to work with, that they can still do this going forward if they want to. I do think, again, if the deadline is passed and if they did pay the roster bonus, it does feel that it likely makes it a little bit less likely that they would do an extension. It feels like if they would have done an extension, they would have, kind of worked everything all into one. But again, at this point, we just don't know, but it's interesting nonetheless that the deadline was Friday. And again, as of recording this episode, we didn't hear anything about it, which likely means they just paid out the roster bonus. So interesting news or note there potentially, but we'll kind of take a look at it in the next couple of days and see if anything trickles out. Tom Silverstein's been on top of this with, Packers News and Journal Sentinel. So I'm sure he will remain on top of it. Another piece of news, Lane Taylor visited with the San Francisco 49ers. This was interesting. Frankly, I thought the perfect marriage here was between the Packers and Lane Taylor. I didn't think that any other team was going to have interest in Lane Taylor because he hasn't played in 2 years, right? He had the biceps injury, then the ACL, and just hasn't played in 2 years. I don't know what a 30-year-old offensive line who has, is new to your system coming off 2 years of not playing for any other team. I'm not sure what that does for you. For Green Bay, he knows Matt LaFleur's system. I know he didn't get to play in it too much in the last 2 years, but he certainly knows the system. He looked better at right guard last year in camp than he did at any point in his career. He looked fantastic. and then, played well in the game before going out with the really early injury in week 1. But it just seems like this is like a perfect match made in heaven for like a 1-year vet minimum deal for Lane Taylor. You bring him back, you get depth. He's played left tackle, left guard, right guard, could probably even play right tackle in a pinch. Green Bay loves that versatility. He knows the system. I get that there's been the injuries, but man, I mean, as a veteran offensive lineman on a vet minimum, those are the type of deals, the safe moves that you need to make, when you don't have that much cap. So it always seemed like just this perfect match for both Lane Taylor and the Packers, a 1-year vet minimum. If Taylor goes and balls out, maybe next year he could get one more, I'm not going to say big deal, but like a legitimate deal. Maybe gets like a 2-year, $5 million, 2-year, $10 million at max, something like that, if he had an amazing season this year. And in Green Bay, he would have a legit chance to compete for a starting job, especially with Bakhtiari potentially out early, maybe having to play Elton Jenkins and Billy Turner out at tackle. That leaves Lucas Patrick, John Running Jr., and then potentially Lane Taylor as starters, week 1 with no Bakhtiari, dependent upon what happens in free agency and the draft, of course. But he would have a real opportunity to compete. Even if Bakhtiari's healthy, you're just going up against Runyon, Stepaniak, Lucas Patrick potentially for a job inside. That's an easily winnable battle for you if you're Lane Taylor. So just seemed like always a really good match, but he visits San Francisco and we'll see if something comes of that. It sounds like it was more just like a medical check for San Fran to see where he's at with things. Didn't seem like anything was imminent, but at least it's interesting that Taylor's taking visits, and it may not just be something that's a foregone conclusion that he ends up back in Green Bay, which I thought at one point it was. And then as the Kyle Fuller saga continues, the Bears signed Desmond Trufant on Friday, and every indication is that they're going to move on from Kyle Fuller. We just don't know at this point if it's a trade or if they're going to actually release him. And if we're being real here, neither's a really great sign for Green Bay right now. First of all, if they trade him, there's no chance that they trade him in division to Green Bay. If they release him, early reports are that Denver and the Chargers are two of the teams that are very, very high on Kyle Fuller. But of interest there, who are the two defensive coaches there? Brandon Staley, Vic Fangio, two people very interested in Kyle Fuller. So Green Bay, before even they were running this Vic Fangio system, they loved Kyle Fuller, made the huge offer sheet to him a few years back, and now they're running the system that he's fit perfectly for. You got to think that Green Bay's interested, but I just don't know that they're going to have the money to compete with a top-end offer, potentially from some of these other teams out there. So we'll see what happens. I still think there's a decent chance that he ends up traded, which, like I said, definitely not going to trade him in division. Green Bay Chicago's not going to do Green Bay any favors there. So if it's a trade, it's a 0% non-starter. If he's a free agent, they're going to have to really run after him. I just don't think they have the flexibility to do that, but definitely still a name to keep an eye on, and obviously would make a really great fit. Also, it sounds like Akeem Hicks could or could not be on the way out in Chicago. We don't know 100% for sure, but there's definitely been some tea leaves to read there with Akeem Hicks, and potentially being on the way out would be another potential really interesting move for Green Bay. Teaming Akeem Hicks with Kenny Clark inside would just be so much fun. Again, not sure what the price would be, but fun to think about, at least if you're a Packer fan. All right, that brings me to my main topic today. And I want to go just really quickly, position by position, and go over what's the ultimate way to fill these roster holes through the remainder of the offseason. Is it a veteran, minimum type free agent? Is it a mid-tier free agent? Maybe they have a home run swing to do as a free agent. Is it a early, day 1, day 2 pick? Is it a late, draft pick? Or is it an undrafted free agent? Like, what's the best way to fill all these roster spots? Let's start at quarterback. We know it's going to be Rodgers 1 and Jordan Love 2. You have to think that that number 3 spot is probably going to be just a developmental guy, probably for camp. You're not looking to take too many snaps away from Jordan Love in season. It wouldn't shock me once you get to the 5th round if Green Bay had a quarterback there that they liked, that they could bring in a 5th, 6th, 7th round guy, to be that number 3 guy as a developmental player. If he shows enough in camp, you keep him on the 53. If he doesn't, you try to sneak him on the practice squad. But I definitely think starting round 5, that becomes within the realm of possibility. And then definitely undrafted free agent. Even if they draft somebody rounds 5 through 7, usually you like to have 4 quarterback arms in camp. So a late round pick and an undrafted free agent would certainly make a ton of sense. I also think they could potentially go with a veteran camp guys. So like a Brian Hoyer, for example, one, maybe somebody on the team that can still relate to Aaron Rodgers a little bit as he gets up there in age. Number two, somebody again that can quiz Rodgers. He loves having that backup quarterback in the room that can, keep him sharp and do a lot of the work. That could be something that Brian Hoyer, like a player like Brian Hoyer or a Chase Daniel could be effective with. But more importantly, Rodgers doesn't have time to, mentor a Jordan Love, right? He has a million other things on his plate. But a guy like a Brian Hoyer, somebody like that could very, very much mentor, Brian Hoyer. And I know that that's what coaches are for and things like that, but it comes different and hits different when it's a player. So a Chase Daniel, Brian Hoyer, and it would have to be like a vet minimum deal, a Josh McCown, somebody like that as your number 3 quarterback could make some sense, especially even if it's just in training camp. A Matt Moore, I don't even know if he's a free agent, but those are some names that could make sense. But I think ultimately late round pick, undrafted free agent. Running back, as you fill out that roster, they don't need a ton, right? Jones and Dillon are going to be 1 and 2. You've got 2 developmental guys in Dexter Williams and Patrick Taylor. I think, Tyler Ervin could be a guy that you bring back as a gadget guy still, probably later in camp. I think you could absolutely make a run at a vet minimum free agent later in camp if like a guy like a James White or a Duke Johnson would still be there later. That could make some sense. But I think ultimately you're looking at a late, mid to late, day 3 pick, maybe 5th, 6th, 7th round, and then probably an undrafted free agent or 2 just to come in. Maybe you hit on a late round pick like you did with an Aaron Jones. Maybe you find an undrafted free agent gem, but I think that's where Green Bay will look to fill out that roster. Wide receiver, as I kind of talked about yesterday, I don't see them signing a veteran here. I think this is going to be, they try to fill out numbers 5 and 6 on their roster. And I think you're going to go with your core 3, MVS, Lazard, Adams, Funchess as an interesting 4, and then EQ and Malik Taylor. Those type of players will compete with, I think, a 2nd round pick, a 4th round pick, maybe a 5th, like 2 picks somewhere, probably not 1st, but anywhere 2nd through 7th. And if they went receiver 1st round pick, that wouldn't shock me, but I definitely think they take a couple of receivers, and that's how they fill out the back end of that roster at wide receiver. Tight end, a couple interesting things here. What happens with Bobby Tunyon if he signs his tender and doesn't get signed anywhere else, which I think is most likely? That obviously fills your biggest gap. Does Mercedes Lewis come back? That's still a question mark. I think both those guys do. If Lewis doesn't come back, maybe a guy like Virgil Green or Darren Fells could fit that role a little bit. Not the blocker that Mercedes Lewis is, but okay blockers that can provide a little bit of receiving ability as well. I don't think they can draft one early unless Tunyon leaves. If they did draft one 1st or 2nd round, which I think is unlikely, I think what you could see is that means they're kind of giving up on Sternberger and maybe would try to trade him for a day 3 pick at some point if they did pick one early, because there's only so many tight ends that you can fit on this roster. And if they have Tunyon and Mercedes Lewis and, then a early draft pick, you've got Dominique Daphne, you've got DeGuara. I mean, that just becomes a diminishing, law of diminishing returns there. So I don't think they're going to, be in the market, but maybe a late round blocking tight end in the draft. Offensive line, I think they have to be open to anything at this point, whether it's a veteran on the outside that can be a swing tackle, even if they found a player on the interior that they thought could come in and compete for a starting job, bringing back a Lane Taylor, somebody like a Michael Schofield who started in this league as a tackle and a guard. He's not good, but he's valuable because he has versatility and can kind of come in and play a few different positions. But certainly anything in the draft, 1st through 7th round, undrafted free agents. I've said all along, my prediction is that Green Bay will pick an offensive lineman with their 1st round pick, whether that's a tackle, maybe even somebody like a Creed Humphrey, could basically be a plug and play exchange for Corey Linsley. So there's definitely some options there, but all options available on the offensive line. Defensive line, Kenny Clark, Dean Lowry, Kingsley Keke. That's about it on the defensive line. Tyler Lancaster's not tendered. Montravius Adams is gone. I think really here they can address it in a variety of different ways. If they went veteran and got a Geno Atkins, a Jarrell Casey, and Akeem Hicks, none of those players would surprise me. They could get Tyler Lancaster back at a lesser deal, like more of a vet minimum, rather than that $2 million restricted free agent mark. But they have to be aggressive here, and anywhere in the draft, I don't think there's a great option round 1 for them, but anywhere in the draft is feasible to start filling out the depth along the defensive line. Edge, I know they've got Gary and Preston and Za'Darius, but Preston is probably in his last season. Za'Darius, they have a major choice on next year if they want to keep him or not. Obviously, there's Rashawn Gary, but You can never have enough pass rushers. I think first round in this draft would be rich, but there's a lot of potential around that spot, pick 29, where it's not a great edge rusher draft, but there's like 5 or 6 guys that could go right around that spot. So it's not out of the question, and certainly anything rounds 2 through 7 or undrafted free agent could be a pick there as well. Linebacker, I really think that they're going to go with Barnes and Martin and Ty Summers and just try to fill it out. Maybe another day 3 selection. Maybe it's a day 2 guy. I do think a veteran here would be nice. Maybe like a Josh Bynes. I think a Kenny Vaccaro would be really interesting as a safety linebacker hybrid. Obviously played in Tennessee while Matt LaFleur was there. I think he could be an interesting piece there. Or maybe you bring back a Raven Green as well. Corners, where I'm expecting them still to make a splash if they do. There's a lot of players still out there. Richard Sherman, Adoree Jackson, potentially Kyle Fuller, Xavier Rhodes, AJ Bouye, Casey Hayward. I dare to utter the name Kevin King if things got really bad. All those could be pieces that they bring back. They have to do something at that position. I'd be shocked if one of those players I just named, didn't end up in Green Bay in some capacity, just because they have to do something there to fill out that spot. And obviously, I would expect corners very early and often in the draft. I would expect them to leave with 2 or 3, maybe even 4 defensive backs from this draft. And it wouldn't shock me if they went early, second, third round, first, third round, something like that on a couple of corners. Safety, if they did sign somebody, Jaquiski Tart, as I mentioned, Kenny Vaccaro as a safety hybrid linebacker could make some sense. Tart could play some safety with Savage as you move Amos into the box. But certainly some rookies could be here to fill out the roster. I do think they like Vernon Scott and Henry Black, so I don't think they need to be super aggressive here, but some day 3 flyers to try to fill out some depth could easily make some sense. And then kicker, punter, long snapper, all things that could be addressed on day 3 or, in undrafted free agency, just to provide some competition in camp. If you hit on a kicker and he just looks amazing in camp, you could cut ties with Crosby to save some money on the cap, which they're trying to save every penny they can. Definitely wouldn't recommend it. Bring Crosby back, but kicker, punter, long snapper, anything late rounds or undrafted free agency would not be a surprise. All right, thanks so much for joining me today. Enjoy the rest of March Madness. I'll be right back here tomorrow. Make sure to check out Jason and Paul and Mark on today's audio version of the podcast. But until next time, and as always, go Pack Go.